Hi students, welcome to HSC Biology and Module 5, Heredity. This is video 30, our penultimate video for Heredity on population genetics and disease. In this particular video, what we're trying to do is, similarly to the previous one on conservation, we're looking at large-scale databases where there's lots of data on inheritance patterns, population genetics, studies of individual species, that helps us to determine various things, in this case, the inheritance of a disease or a disorder. So a couple of areas that you might like to focus on. Firstly, being able to identify an inherited disease or a disorder, to be able to link that to concepts associated with population genetics and or large database information, and to be able to specifically link population genetic data in relation to a specific example of disease inheritance. So, whilst we're going to spend a lot more time looking at diseases later on in the topic, in the course, let's just have a quick overview now. Firstly, developments in DNA and gene technologies have provided lots of opportunities for us to study a range of fundamental life history traits. Now, one of the things that we are aware of as we become more interested in the information that's contained within DNA is that we are starting to link certain conditions, certain disorders and or disease to genes, to information that's carried in the DNA. And this is not just for human species, but for a range of different biological organisms. So what we're doing is we're looking at what current technologies we have available that can help us to predict some of the patterns and hopefully have varying degrees of accuracy. We'd like it to be very high if we're going to be doing predictions. We always like to make sure that our predictions are relatively accurate, and we can only do that with the best information. We have talked about the Sanger method for DNA sequencing previously to make sure that we can find exact sequences of DNA. That means that if there's been any change to the DNA sequence, any mutations, anything that's not what was originally or expected, then we can see what's there and we can get a bit of a sense of how things have changed and potentially how those changes may actually influence the individual in terms of their phenotype. So in class for this particular area, we're going to look at three, I think, interesting case studies that link into this idea of not just data, not just population genetic data, but also what we know that we can do with that data in relation to certain types of diseases. One of those interesting ones that's relevant for us here in Australia is the facial tumour that's on the Tassie Devils. Now, I did try and find a picture of one of these facial tumours, but they're actually quite confronting. They're not very nice. And so this is just a cute little Tassie devil without the facial tumour. But this has been quite a problem amongst devil populations. And interesting about a cancer is that it has actually been passed from one individual to another in the same way that infectious diseases are passed. And as I say, when we're trying to look at how population data relates to disease, we're going to spend a lot of time later in this course looking at different types of diseases and how they're transmitted or what the causes of them are. So this is going to be a useful thing to feed back into later on. I think it's kind of a little bit out of sequence at the moment. But nevertheless, one of the things that we know about cancers is about things called oncogenes. And I'm sure you'd be aware of the fact that that onco is often used in relation to the study of cancer. Oncology units are full of patients with cancers. And onco just means mass. So this is basically genes that are involved in cell replication. So one of the things we know about cancers is that the growth rate of the cells is abnormally high. So you get lots and lots of cells growing virtually out of control. Now they can remain benign within a capsule, or they can metastasize and start to move throughout the body. And those are the malignant tumors, and they're just because it's better to find all of those individual cells. Now, treatment for cancers can go down the track of surgery to try and remove the cancerous cells, radiation or chemotherapy. But if we knew something about the genes, particularly if we can start to do some population genetics, find out whether there's some aspect of the genome of these individual Tassie devils that have this facial tumor, that also have certain genes or certain expressions, certain sequences within those genes in common, maybe there are ways we can even figure out how to turn off those genes that are involved in DNA, in cell replication. So this is one potential application, by being able to relate the genetic information within a population to a particular type of condition. Some big data has been collected in Iceland as well, and it was reported recently. And whilst they've done a lot of ancestral studies, and so this relates quite nicely to our last topic in this module, they've also been looking at the incidence of diseases in the population as well, and specifically things which they've called knockouts. So knockouts are basically areas where genes have been turned off. So there's a mechanism that stops them from being expressed. And so these knockout genes are quite an interesting study that are coming through from this Icelandic genome database. About a third of the population has been sequenced. And so they're getting lots of information. They can do ancestry, as I said, ancestry testing on people from Iceland, what backgrounds, where have they come from, but also looking at some similarities within the gene pool itself, incidences on allele frequencies, as we've talked about in terms of population genetics, is very important. And one final one, which I think is useful for you to be having a little bit of a look at, and we'll do this as a case study in class, is the idea of lactose tolerance and intolerance. Obviously, when we're young, we feed on milk, so we need to have an enzyme present that breaks down that milk, breaks down the proteins into the important amino acids that we need. Now, there are studies in populations, obviously you'd be aware of the fact that there are people who have an intolerance to lactose. Sometimes that's happened from birth. Sometimes that develops once the young mature, because you don't drink milk your whole life, certainly not at the rate that you do when you're young. And again, there seems to be certain genetic markers, certain genetic links with this idea of lactose tolerance and lactose intolerance. And we do that again by studying different types of human populations, looking at the distribution of different types of genes amongst different populations, and seeing if there's been any sort of selecting pressures which may have shifted the frequency of different types of genes or expressions of genes, the production of enzymes, for example, over successive generations. So this is the sort of stuff that we're interested in. I can't really go to a lot of detail on a video, but it gives you just a bit of an idea of some of the areas that we can look at when we're trying to tie together the incidence of certain diseases or disorders with our study of genetic populations. Epidemiology is a critical field in terms of the study of the patterns of disease or the incidence of disease around the world. And some of this information is very relevant to us in the age of COVID, because we're quite, I guess, comfortable speaking about the incidence of disease, the transmission, the numbers in populations, the importance of testing, the importance of data in terms of making decisions, and all of those sorts of things, I think are very important, have a very important scientific grounding. And despite the fact that we haven't probably done enough background in diseases yet, this should give you a little introduction here into the link between disease and population genetics before we get on to some in-depth looks at diseases later on. Good luck with your case studies, and thanks for watching.